Wonderful. Let's go ahead and get started. So before we truly dive into the material tonight, I do believe it's beneficial to essentially take a step back and consider what we're working with over the course of the year, right? And so if you chat with our yard advising team, you may hear us chat about growth potential, which this diagram is essentially a simplified version of this, but the key concept or the key idea is still here. So if we were to break this season down into the 4 key seasons, so winter, spring, summer, and fall, and the required amount of energy. So essentially, how much time we would expect you to be investing in the lawn, this is what it would look like. So in the wintertime, the grass is most likely dormant. So the grass isn't growing. It has almost that hay look to it. And we really don't want to be fertilizing. We don't want to be mowing, most likely not watering, and really very minimal care, if any at all, at this time of the year. This is a great time to essentially start prepping for the season. So if there's any equipment maintenance you'd like to complete, such as sharpening your mower blade, getting ready to audit your sprinkler system, maybe not quite at this point if the system's essentially been shut down for the winter, but it's good to start thinking about it. And then as we start to transition into the spring here, so I would say, Vanna, what would you say for Texas? Maybe getting closer to the 60-degree range or so. Still not quite at the point where we would expect the grass to be actively growing per se, but we may start to see some changes, right? And this is really when we want to start prepping for the upcoming season. So if you didn't start to complete some of those tasks earlier in the season, this is a great time to do so. As the temps start to increase a bit more so getting closer to the 70-degree range, then the grass is going to start actively growing, right? You're going to see it start to green up and grow, right? So green up can start a little bit earlier, but we want to make sure that the grass is essentially also growing. And this is when we would consider starting with that fertilizer application. We'd start discussing watering. We'd start discussing mowing. But again, it isn't going to be right here in the late spring that we'll expect the most energy to be required. This will be more so in early to mid-summer or so, once the temps are more consistently in the 80-degree range. And we'll be able to start discussing if we need to overhaul the soil. So for example, if we need to discuss aerating, top dressing, seeding, plugging, sprigging, we'll chat more about repair options later here tonight. But this is really going to be a key point of emphasis. As the temps continue to increase in the summertime, however, we may see the lawn start to slow down a bit, right? It might not necessarily enter a complete summer dormancy, if you will, but once the temps start to transition more so into the 90s, potentially up into over 100, then the grass may start to slow down a little bit, right? And this is a good time to essentially take a step back, evaluate where we're at in the season, and come up with a plan for once the temps start to drop a bit. And in the early fall there, we would expect those temps to dip a bit, the growth potential required amount of energy to essentially increase before ultimately declining in the fall once we start to drop from that 80-degree range or so down into the 70s and below before entering dormancy in the wintertime potentially. So again, this is not something that I would spend a significant amount of time considering or reviewing, right? But I do believe it's beneficial to take a step back and just keep this in the back of your mind, especially when we start discussing some of these practices of, okay, well, where are we at in the season? Is this really something I should be completing now? Later in the season, if the grass is stressed, should I be adjusting the schedule, etc.?
Well, we did have a quick question from Karen here. She has asked if we have anything to kill crabgrass, but not the grass, so a selective herbicide for crabgrass. And also her grass is just starting to grow, and she wanted to know if it's okay to put the lawn vitality on.
Great question. So keep in mind, so crabgrass especially, so these grassy weeds, and Ivana, feel free to jump in here. She's our weed expert. But with crabgrass or these grassy weeds that essentially resemble turfgrass, right? It's very difficult to be able to apply an herbicide that is selective, right? Which wouldn't damage the turfgrass as well. So our only herbicide, Weed Warrior, which would be effective against the crabgrass, is unfortunately effective against actively growing turfgrass as well. In regards to the second question about whether or not to apply the lawn vitality, yes, as long as the grass is greening up and it's actively growing, then we can certainly go ahead and continue with that application. Great questions.
And Karen, I did want to note too, there is a little bit of time between when your grass is dormant to the growing season. where the crabgrass starts to grow before your turf grass. When your turf grass is dormant, the weed warrior will not kill the grass. So you can spray the crabgrass with weed warrior when your grass is dormant. You just want to make sure it's still in full dormancy. So I wouldn't do this if like you were already planning to apply in a pouch. It would be kind of just when that crabgrass is starting to come up as well.
Wonderful. And so then the four key steps we'll be discussing tonight are watering, mowing, fertilizing, and repairing. And I'll pass it over to Ivana to discuss the first two actions here.
Yeah, so watering is a pretty big part of any sort of lawn care routine. This is something that even if you've got irrigation, something automated, even if you've got smart sprinklers, this is something you really want to keep on top of because it's really hard to kind of figure out when something went wrong after it's already gone wrong. So for example, once your grass starts waking up, now is a really great time, or maybe even a little bit earlier since our grass is already greening up now, to audit your sprinkler system. So, go out, kind of watch your sprinklers, see if there's any points where the sprinkler is damaged or just not spraying where you need it to. Keep in mind that if it's a really windy day, maybe your sprinkler will move a little bit so that you can adjust for that as well. Um, as far as watering goes during the growing season, you want to do about zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.5 inches of water per session, only if there's no precipitation. You don't want to overwater your grass. This is something that is hard for some people to grasp because, too much of a good thing can actually damage a lawn. So if you're watering too much, you might start to see some fungal issues. You might start to see some of the areas kind of rotting and kind of pulling back. So you just want to make sure when you're watering to make sure you do it infrequently, meaning that, you let it dry out between each watering. So for example, if you're in Texas right now, I would only start watering twice a week, half an inch each time. We did get a ton of rain last week, so I didn't water at all last week, but now that I don't have any rain for a few days, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to water half an inch. And then I think there's some rain later in the year, or in the week. So I can leave it up to Mother Nature there. But just keeping in mind that deep watering is also very important. You want to get those roots deeper into the soil. So this will help your grass in a few different ways. This is great for stress response. So once it gets really hot outside and the water kind of evaporates super quickly. If your grass has really deep roots, it'll be able to access that water further into the soil. And this is something too, Karen, that you spoke about having crabgrass. Crabgrass has very shallow, widespread roots. So if you're watering deeply and infrequently, it'll also help kind of kill off the crabgrass because it's not going to be getting the moisture that it needs. This is something for a lot of different weeds, something like a nutsedge. If you see that, deep and infrequent watering will help make sure that those don't come back. And again, with watering, if you're unsure, if you want to make sure you're not going to overwater, the best thing to do would kind of keep a lookout for signs of stress responses. So if you go walk on your lawn, if you start to see, your footprints stay in the lawn, if you start to see kind of a blue-gray hue, which is kind of difficult for some grasses, I know like a St. Augustine sometimes can kind of be blue-gray, but I would just look for any changes. So if it looks different than it normally does, it might be time to water. If the leaves start to fold in half, especially for a St. Augustine, that's also a good sign that it's time to water. Best time to water early mornings, 6 a.m., 10 a.m. to 10 a.m. That's the kind of the sweet spot for watering. Watering at night is okay in dry areas because it'll allow the lawn to dry out, have a good amount of time for it to kind of take in the water, but then, let the rest of the water leave. If you water at night in a humid place, say Houston, this could kind of open you up for more fungal issues. This could encourage a lot more fungal growth. You might start to see it stay wet in the morning. You might start to see it kind of breaking apart. If you see anything growing on the grass, anything, white or black or mushy, anything like that, it's most likely a fungal issue. And for the most part, cutting back on watering is going to help that.
Ivana, one of the questions we receive pretty frequently, right, is what about customers with high clay soils, right? And so wanting to sort of balance that uh, watering deeply and infrequently, but then leading to either runoff or essentially just cooling, right? What would you recommend there?
Yeah, so with clay soil, something you'll see, Texas, Tennessee's got some heavy clay, Georgia's got clay. If you try to stick with these deep and frequent practices, you might start to see it like running off instead of being absorbed into your soil. So that means that, you've got a heavy clay, maybe it's compacted, something like that. You're going to want to implement what we call cycle soaking. So this is just watering for short amount of time over a long period of time, if that makes sense. So water for, start your sprinklers at 6 a.m., water for 3 minutes, turn off for 3 minutes, water for 3 minutes, so on and so forth until you feel like the grass is saturated. And this just allows it to take in a little bit at a time, but you're not watering frequently and encouraging fungal growth. you're still getting the water deeper into the soil and encouraging those deep roots. And mowing. People don't think a lot about mowing. Usually, you take out your mower at the beginning of the season, you dust it off, scare the spiders away, and then you can just go ahead and mow. But there's a couple things that you do want to keep in mind when it's time to mow your lawn. So something that you want to do at least once a year is to sharpen and clean your mower blades. It can be kind of hard to just kind of verbally demonstrate, so I'll be linking a video from our blog that kind of goes over sharpening your mower blades in the follow-up email. But you just want to make sure that they're sharp. There's a few different reasons for this. One of them is that you just want to make sure these grass blades are cut completely cleanly. Otherwise, they'll start to see, like in this image, they'll start to tear a little bit. And not only does that make your lawn look a little frumpy, a little like it's almost dormant, but it's also a really good way to invite different bacterial infections or fungal infections. So making sure you've got clean, sharp mower blades is a really important thing for your grass health. And something else to keep in mind is just cutting as you need it, and not cutting too much each time. So cutting a lot of grass at one time kind of triggers a stress response. It's really damaging to cut half the blade when you can just cut a little bit at a time. So mowing frequently is going to be like once a week for a lot of our southern customers. Just making sure that mowing frequently and a little bit high as well. And what mowing high does is keeps a lot of that grass material there, which holds nutrients and holds water. It also has the added benefit of crowding out a lot of those weeds. So something like a crabgrass isn't going to want to grow in a lawn that's 4 inches tall because it can't get enough sun to the crown of the plant. Since it spreads out, it wants that sun in that middle of the plant, and it's not going to be able to get it if the grass is too high. So something to keep in mind is just mow often, mow high. If you've got a lot of weeds, something to keep in mind is you can't spot treat them is to bag your clippings. Make sure that you're removing all of that weed material out of the lawn so that they're not able to spread. And you can take those out in the green recycling. You can throw them in a compost pile. Weed seeds will denature in home compost piles. They are hot enough. I checked. So just keep in mind that's another really good way to keep weeds at bay. It's just making sure you're bagging those clippings.
I don't think we can necessarily put numbers to this, but if you had to estimate, right, the majority of questions that we'll receive over the course of the summer, especially, right, or heading into the spring season, how many relate to watering and or mowing, right? I mean, the majority of these where even if they're not the primary stressor, the sole stressor, these are two critical factors.
Hugely important. Yeah, watering is something that a lot of people underestimate, and that's something that you're going to have to keep on top of. You even are going to have to adjust it over the course of the season. So in summer months, add an extra session, or if it stays a little bit cooler than you thought it was going to be, take away a session. It's a lot more dynamic than people give it credit for. You want to make sure that you're kind of listening to your grass and making sure you know what it needs when it needs it.
All right, transitioning to fertilizing. So the bread and butter of the Sunday plan, right? This is what you signed up for. And so why fertilize? Well, the short answer here is not all soils are perfect, right? And so we want to make sure with Sunday's plan, we are following MLSM, or minimum levels of sustainable nutrition guidelines. So essentially, once you receive that first box, if you haven't already, we recommend collecting your soil samples, submitting that in just so we can account for any nutrient deficiencies which are present within the soil. Now, when to fertilize? Well, this year with the introduction of our My Plan page, you can see on the right-hand side here, we do provide recommended application dates with each nutrient pouch application, right? And you can also see you're able to essentially check them off over the course of the year. And I missed out on my Fall Fortify application. But this is a great tool to be able to refer back to. Now, the reason that we're spending a portion tonight discussing this is we want to make sure that while these application date ranges are a great starting point, they're not the end-all be-all when it comes to pouch applications, right? And so what I mean by that is we'll discuss this in more detail in the order of operations webinar, but we want to make sure that the grass is going to be able to benefit from the pouch application. So for example, if it is an extremely cool spring, right, where compared to the historical climate data or the historical average, we're a couple of weeks behind, then we might end up shifting that first pouch application date a bit just to account for the change for this current year's weather, right? And so similarly, if you're looking at the grass, you're thinking, okay, I think it's just starting to green up a bit, but I feel like it might be better if I hold off on that pouch application for a week. We can certainly do that, right? And so we build it. There's a significant amount of flexibility with these application schedules to be able to account for these factors, but then also sort of the random factors as well, such as you're getting ready to apply a pouch and the thunderstorm rolled in, right? And you were unable to apply the pouch. So just keep in mind that this is a great starting point, but we can certainly adjust as needed, and we'll be able to essentially incorporate any remaining pouches either sometime this season or worst case scenario in a future season as well.
And well, this is a good time to mention we get a lot of questions in the spring about when to apply your pouches in relation to seeding. Did you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, really good question, Ivana. So our pouches will not harm grass seed, right? So you could essentially walk out, seed, and apply a pouch shortly afterwards without there being damage. But I would keep in mind that the pouches are going to be absorbed fairly quickly, right? So if you want to make sure that the newly seeded areas are essentially best able to benefit from that application, I would wait for those seeded areas to be established. Or for any of these repaired areas, right? So if you aren't seeding, if you're installing plugs or installing, well, we'll touch on sod in just a moment here. So essentially just making sure that the grass is going to be able to benefit. So if we need to shift those application dates a bit, we can certainly do so, even if it's a number of weeks. So typically the question I keep in mind is from a seeding perspective, we could apply the pouches without damaging the grass, but it would be better to hold on to them. If you have had sod installed, however, then it is much more imperative to hold on to those pouches. So essentially sod is typically installed well fertilized, right? So just to make sure we minimize the risk of over fertilization, we generally recommend waiting for that sod to be well rooted, typically a few weeks or so. So essentially holding up to the plug or the pull test. And once it completes that test, then we could look to incorporate the nutrient pouch application. So I would say in all situations, it'd be beneficial to hold on to the pouches if you're repairing any areas, but with sod especially, make sure to wait. Really good question.
And then we also had a question from Karen asking about on your My Plan page, which one is the same as Lawn Vitality? She didn't receive anything like a Mighty Green or a Lawn Strong.
Yeah, really well. And so the downside here is that I'm in New York, so slightly different. And if you receive similar pouches to I have, it's all based on the climate and essentially what we deem to be best suited for your lawn. So depending on your soil test results and essentially where you're located as well, that first pouch may be slightly different. But generally, the first pouch included on that My Plan page is what you'll be looking to apply as your first application. Really good point. And lastly, when it comes to repair, so again, we'll touch more on this in the order of ops webinar, essentially of when we look to repair and what repair truly means. But as a broad overview, these are some of the warm season grasses you'll hear us refer to. Typically, the 4 key warm season grasses we're typically receiving the most questions about are Bermuda grass, centipede grass, St. Augustine, and zoysia. And so each has its pros and cons, right? We have a general chart here, essentially providing the tolerances of each grass. So you can see with Bermuda, especially very high heat tolerance, but and fairly low water requirement, but doesn't do quite as well in the shade, right? Versus St. Augustine, for example, is a fairly high shade tolerance, but will require a bit more water than Bermuda. So this is a conversation we can have in more detail if you are looking to repair any areas, or if you're looking to decide if we should incorporate a different grass type, or essentially what would be the best grass type, but this is a good starting point. The key points to keep in mind here, though, is that these grasses are all going to grow or be best propagated via different forms, right? So for example, with the Bermuda grass, we do offer Bermuda Thyme, which is Bermuda grass seed blend, which would be a great option to essentially repair thinner areas. But St. Augustine, for example, doesn't produce viable seeds. So we'd be looking to install plugs or strips of sod. Might also discuss just adding a bit of top dress to essentially encourage that St. Augustine to spread. Ivana, again, will be the best person to chat about this with her St. Augustine lawn. And then for centipede and zoysia, for example, while you may be able to purchase grass seed, it may take a bit to germinate, right? So then we start to discuss, well, would it make more sense to install plugs? Does it make sense to look to install sod? So there are definitely a number of factors which we could look to discuss here from a repair standpoint, but just keeping in mind that each grass is going to have its own pros and cons, and each is going to have its own options for essentially best being able to repair itself. But keep in mind, these warm season grasses, for the most part, are going to naturally spread as well from either rhizomes and or stolons. So to a certain extent, they will be able to repair themselves.
And that's one of the pluses of warm season grasses. A lot of cool season grasses can't spread like that. So, if you start noticing a smaller, bare area in your lawn, go through, add a little bit of compost, add a little bit of topsoil. If you've got very long runners, which are kind of like the vines that these grasses grow, you can pin them in those areas and they'll root in and kind of cover those spaces for you.
And one of the questions, especially if anybody's moved from further north to down south, I know one of the questions that I was always surprised by was up north, we have a mix of grasses generally, right? So we might have a little bit of fescue, we might have a little bit of bluegrass, a little bit of rye, but with warm season grasses, we're a bit more selective with making sure we're not incorporating different grasses. Ivana, do you have any tips there for what if you have a very sunny area in the lawn and then an area that's a bit more shaded? What would you recommend there?
Yeah, so you could use a couple different grasses if you wanted, or you can just use a grass that's kind of okay at both. For example, my lawn is mostly St. Augustine, but there's a very dry, sunny area that I kind of just let the Bermuda take over from my neighbor's lawn because the St. Augustine's not going to do very well there. The Bermuda's already happy there, so I can kind of just let it spread. If you have, a very, very sunny, hot area, you can see Bermuda. Let's say your front lawn is full sun, doesn't get a lot of water, it's a little bit tough to grow anything there. Put some Bermuda there. Your backyard super shady and it's kind of a little bit more moist than your front lawn, you can see the zoysia there. So it's totally okay to have a couple different grasses. Sometimes they just don't play well together. So you want to make sure as you're kind of surveying your lawn, if you're starting from scratch, just to know, what your different spots are and what you can use to pair the different grasses with.
Great. Well, that is everything that we had prepared for tonight. So we'll go ahead. Please feel free to submit any questions. We're happy to take a few more minutes here to essentially walk through any additional questions. But Vine, I do believe there were a couple of questions that we received as part of the registration, right? One was more so essentially how to tackle weeds in a newly sodded lawn. And so any brief thoughts there? So
Yeah, there's a few different things. So if you've got a lawn that's got a ton of weeds, or if it's newly sodded and that has a ton of weeds, something like that. Like I mentioned before, mowing often and mowing high is going to be one of the best things to do just to remove all of those seed heads from your grass, from your weeds. So mowing high, mowing often, and then watering is a really important one. And this does depend on the weed that you're struggling with. So a nut sedge, for example, is going to like a lot of water. So if you start to see that, you can cut back. On the other side of that, if you get something like a spurge, those horrible little ones with the milky sap, those like very dry conditions, so you can pull those as well. Some weeds really like more of a poor soil, so this might be something that you need to start thinking about amending your soil with. So, for example, Central Texas is where I am, so all my examples stem from there. It's in a very heavy clay. It's not very nutrient rich. It's kind of just not a great place for grass. So I end up top dressing my soil twice a year in spring and in fall, just adding a bit of compost, adding some organic matter, and that will also kind of help keep some weeds at bay as well because they like, different conditions than that grass. So just the general, making sure if your grass is happy as can be, the weeds aren't going to be able to get in as well as they could.
and dealing with weeds will be a great resource as well.
It will.
One
I
of
believe
our
that's
other
next week.
webinars.
Is that this week or next week?
I believe it's Thursday.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, come join us on Thursday. We'll talk about weeds.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. Please feel free to send any questions to webinars@getsunday.com. Again, the follow-up survey will automatically populate the screen here once we end the webinar. This was lawn care basics for warm season grasses, and keep an eye out for the follow-up email. Do we have one more question?
Oh, it's just Karen being a very nice person. Thank you, Karen. We're excited to have you. Please reach out to us with webinars that get Sunday if you have any questions along the way. We'd love to chat more about your backyard and healthy options for your pups.
Great. All right. Well, have a great rest of your night, everyone. We'd be thrilled to see you at another webinar. So please feel free to reach out with any questions. Have a great rest of your night. Take care.
Night, y'all.